Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I am glad that I'm talking about this subject in a lecture in honor of a person who was involved in creating the United Nations Charter and the international order that was founded after the Second World War, because as we should see, part of the subject of our talk tonight will be connected to the Charter, the Bill of Rights, the conception of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and debates around these issues. We are also talking about the state that was founded in 1948, very, very close to the creation of the Charter, after a United Nations resolution, and the same year as the publication of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, why should anyone discuss the question of Israel as a Jewish state? On the one hand, one could say that, as I just said, Israel was founded in May 1948 after a resolution by the United Nations General Assembly affirming that there should be in Israel a Jewish state and an Arab state, one alongside the other. So the United Nations said there should be a Jewish state and an Arab state. And the United Nations thought that this was compatible with demanded that both states, the Jewish and the Arab, will be democracies and will give human rights to all the people residing in them, including and specifically members of the other ethnic, national, religious community, Jews for Arabs and Arabs for Jews. In fact, this was not what happened, but the declaration was there. On the other hand, we could think that, yes, this is a subject that must be discussed, because some people say that a Jewish state or any state that is particular is an anachronism in a world that is moving away from particular states into civic states. And besides, the same United Nations General Assembly that decided it should be a Jewish state in 1947 held between the years 75 and 91 that Zionism, the movement that culminated in the Jewish state, was a form of racism. Racism, as you well know, is one of the greatest evils condemned by the Charter and by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and human rights law. So we see that there is an interesting mix here that suggests that something here is more complicated than what meets the eye. The question of Israel as a Jewish state gained more visibility both in Israel and in international discourse because of two additional factors or events. One was the fact that in 1992, Israel, which like Australia has a complicated relationship to the idea of constitution, judicial review, Bill of Rights, as a part of a very long and tortured constitutional process, passed two basic laws dealing with human rights, freedom of occupation and human dignity and freedom, and it, for the first time, defined Israel as a Jewish and democratic state as part of the laws of Israel. I mean, Israel was seen as a Jewish state and defined as a Jewish state by many commentators before that, but this was a move to introduce this duality as a self-definition of Israel into Israel's laws. At the same time, more or less, the peace process, Oslo process, starting in 1993, we were talking again about the two states for two peoples position. Two states for two peoples meant, going back to November decision, a Jewish state for the Jewish people, and an Arab state, a Palestinian state for the Arab Palestinian people. But it became a bone of contention until this very day whether any agreement between Israel and the Palestinians is going to include not only recognition of Israel as a state that should live in recognized and safe borders, but also as a Jewish state. And the Palestinians and the Arab minority within Israel make a special point of saying that no, a settlement should not recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And why it shouldn't recognize Israel as a Jewish state within a solution of two states for two peoples, what's going on here is, again, an indication of the problematics of the subject that I want to address. Now, some people say that what we have here is a usual case of a conceptual confusion, and once we are clear about the meaning of the terms, we see that the problem disappears. The people say, no, 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 this is not about concepts and not about anything, this is about a political struggle. The people who do not want a Jewish state, who didn't want a Jewish state in the 30s and the 40s of the 20th century, still don't want a Jewish state, and this is a fight against the legitimacy of the Jewish state. And it's only politics. We shouldn't really discuss this as a matter of political morality or human rights or whatever. And I think that there are these two elements, but in addition, there is a serious normative political argument to be made here, and that the challenge against the legitimacy of the Jewish state is a challenge that needs to be understood and addressed. I will, therefore, very, very quickly, in skeletal form, sending your way a lot of statements and trying to persuade you that despite the fact that I will not have time to justify or support all of them, I can do that. And if you want to know more, you know, I can direct you to writings, mine and others. But since we have a very kind of short period of time and we're going to talk about a very, very long and complicated conflict, it will have to be very schematic and very skeletal. And I hope I will make a move that will consist of doing three things. A, I will want to distinguish three possible senses of the Jewishness of Israel. And I will want to argue that the justifications for a Jewish state are different and of different validity vis-a-vis the three different meanings. Then I will endorse one of these meanings and seek to very quickly justify it. And then I will try to say a few things about the implications of the intensity of the debate about the legitimacy of the Jewish state and why all of this is not only, I think, interesting theoretically, but also of great relevance politically, in Israel and in the international community. If it had been only in Israel, I wouldn't have subjected you to this subject. I think very highly of our problems, but I don't assume that everyone should be interested in the problems of Israel. But I think that what we are seeing here is something that is of international relevance, not only because of the particular debate about Israel, but because of the presuppositions about nation states, self-determination, human rights, states, and all of that, which are involved in this argument. Okay. So the first part is an attempt to understand what we can mean by a Jewish state. And I argue that there are three clusters of meanings to the term Jewish state, and it's extremely critical to understand the differences between them and the relationships between them. The first cluster of meanings relate to numbers or to the composition of the population. A Jewish state is, or in some other formulation which I see is quite extensive for our purposes here, a state of the Jews is a state in which Jews are a large and stable majority. And we usually or often describe a state by the characterization of its majority population, and that would be a description of Israel as a Jewish state. This is a very weak description of Israel as a Jewish state, and it's also contingent. I mean, there is an empirical question. Is there in a particular moment a Jewish majority? And some other very, very interesting questions arise. What is a Jewish majority? You know, democracy may say 51% is a Jewish majority, and in some senses, 55% in parliament is good enough. But probably it's not good enough, because we are talking about the fabric of society, So in order to speak about a state as Jewish in terms of its population, what do we need? Do we need 90, 80, 70? And these obviously are important questions when we see the type of other populations that exist in a given country. There might be a difference between a 75 majority and 25 minority of the same group, and 75 majority and different minority communities, each of which is 5%. So the demographics of the first cluster of meanings is important. But this is the first meaning, and I think we don't think about this meaning in terms of a justification because this is a fact. Either there is a majority or there isn't. Okay. The second cluster is more important, and it relates to the idea that a state is the nation state, the ethnic nation state of a particular group. In our context, the Jews. Now, a nation state is, again, an ambiguous concept, because some people call all states nation states because they say that the nation constituted by a state is the demos, the group of all the citizens or permanent residents of that state. So Australia is, in Australian sense, a state in the sense that its population consists of Australians, people who are citizens, and yeah, there are also tourists and visitors and people who want to be residents and citizens, but basically it's a country of its citizens irrespective of their non-civic features. But there is another sense of a nation state, which is the sense that I'm invoking when I'm talking about Israel as a Jewish state and not Israel as an Israeli state. And this sense means that there is a special relationship between Israel and the wish of one group, the Jews, to exercise what is recognized in international human rights law as the right of peoples to self-determination. Now, it's very important to note that in order for there to be a case for a state to be the nation state of a people, the group must be a people, and there is some debate about the question whether Jews are a people or just a religion, and I will assume it's a people here. Don't want to go into this debate here, okay? So let's say that Jews are also a people, and the argument that they enjoy a right to self-determination anywhere depends on there being a majority in that territory, and on some other conditions that I will talk about in a minute. But at the moment, I just want to put on the table the second meaning of the Jewishness of the state. The Jewishness of the state is Jewish in the sense that one of its purposes is to permit the Jews to exercise a right to self-determination. The third cluster of meaning of the Jewishness of the state is religious. We are now taking Jewish not vis-a-vis Arab or Palestinian. Now we're taking Jewish vis-a-vis Muslim or Christian. And the question here is, what do we mean by a religious state? It can mean it's a religious state because the origin of most of the population is Jewish. But usually what we mean is something much stronger, and it can go on a very broad spectrum, ending in a full Jewish theocracy, that is a state governed by Jewish religious law as administered and interpreted by Jewish religious leaders, and all kinds of variations of elements of theocracy, non-separation, establishment, all kinds of things that affect a religious Jewish character to the state. So 3, just a majority, a nation state, a religious state. Now, as I said, there is a connection between them. You cannot have a serious nation state without being a majority in a territory. Well, of course, you can have a difference between a nation state and a religious state. One of the unique things about Judaism is that it has a very complex relationship between peoplehood and religion. Don't want, again, to go into that. I'm putting this on the table as a serious problem. But I think it's clear that Jewish has both meanings and that they are distinct. Because the majority of Jews in the world today are not observant, at least by Orthodox criteria. So there are many people who are Jewish, feel Jewish, want to maintain their Jewish identity, want therefore to have an opportunity to live in a state in which they are a majority and they exercise the right to self-determination, and do not see their Jewishness as religious. On the other hand, there are religious Jews who see the Jewish peoplehood as defined exhaustively and exclusively by religious norms. And this complexity, of course, arises. Okay, so these are the three meanings. I said that in order for a state to be a nation state, the group must be a majority. That means that if Israel is going to be justified as a nation state, it is not enough for it to be the contingent fact that it has a Jewish majority at a particular time. It must be legitimate or probably necessary for it to be able to maintain that Jewish majority in order to continue the justification for it being the state in which one particular group enjoys self-determination. Okay. After I do this, I can go to the justification. And I can say very quickly that if the Jewishness of the state is a Jewish theocracy, we don't have an international justification for having a state for a particular religious community. It doesn't exist. The law recognizes the right of peoples to self-determination, not the right of communities of faith to self-determination. This is, among other things, because most communities of faith are sub-state and up and supra-state and all kinds. Doesn't happen. But more than that, I think it's very, very difficult to justify a religious state, despite the fact that there are states like this and there are political groups that aspire to create states like this, especially in the Muslim world. But there are also in the Christian world states in whose identity, not only Christianity, but some form of Christianity is a very important defining element. The problem of justification here comes from two main problems. One is that in most religious communities, there are different attitudes to religion. So to have a state governed by Jewish law, Sharia, or whatever, is something that is going to offend the human rights of people who do not want to be governed by these laws. And this is going to be, of course, even more complicated when in a country, as is often the case, there are minority religious communities that not only are not religious and members of that community in faith in sense of performing commandments, but also refuse to be under the rule of a religion that is not even part of their culture, not to mention their own religious belief. So I do not think that it is justified or can be justified to have a state based on the principle of religious coercion of one religious group. So if the Jewishness of Israel is on the cluster of theocracy, I think there is a serious problem of justifying it. However, I don't think that Israel is a theocracy. It has interesting relations between state and religion. Again, in the limits, the constraints of my very condensed lecture, I cannot say a lot about that. There is one element that should be mentioned. In Israel, there is, unlike in most Western democracy, a religious Orthodox monopoly over matters of personal status. That is, people cannot marry, divorce, have some matters of custody, some adjudicated, not on the basis of religion. First of all, I want to say that this is not necessarily connected to the Jewishness of Israel, because this is the remnant of the millet system of the Ottoman Empire, and it applies to all religions in Israel. It's not only the Jews. Actually, some of the Muslim women are complaining about that, and some of the secular liberal Christians are complaining about that no less than the Jews. But moreover, when the mandatory authorities came in and asked the two communities in Israel, the Jews and the Arabs, if they wanted to continue the millet system or to move to a civil law regulation of matters of personal status, the Jewish majority that was not Orthodox and in parts anti-Orthodox and anti-clerical preferred, as an organized community, a move to civil law. It was the Arab minority that realized that this could be a challenge to their identity that asked for a continuation of the millet system. They were the majority population. The mandatory authorities made the judgment, I think rightly, that it wasn't a good idea to start trying to impose secularization on the population, and this is how the millet system was continued even into Israel. Okay, so we are now talking really, we're putting on the table only the justification of Israel as a Jewish state in terms of the right of self-determination, and my argument is that this idea of having a Jewish state is indeed justified. It was justified in 1947 when it was decided. It was justified in 1937 when the Peace Commission recommended it, and it's still justified today. And I want to do this again very, very quickly. The argument for Israel as a state in which Jews have the right to self-determination is an application of a general principle to the Jews. And the general principle says that we all have and should have respected our individual rights, dignity, freedom, right not to be tortured, all of them, right not to be discriminated against, are all individual human rights. But it was also and always and increasingly so understood that the welfare of individuals also depends on their membership in meaningful, effective communities. Now, some states privatize all the non-civic affiliation of their citizens. Other states do not. But even states that privatize those affiliations, usually as part of the protection of the right to freedom of association, allow religious, linguistic, national, ethnic communities to maintain their identity, which is in addition to their identity as citizens of the state. Now, if you concede that this is the case in all states, but more clearly in states that are founded against the background of a need to provide that, then you have a very different picture of nation states. Israel is not the only example and not even the most recent example of a nation state in this sense. You have an understanding of why this is important. The reason why this is important is that history shows us that serious conflicts are not conflicts between individuals, but conflicts between groups. These are the more violent conflicts, and these are conflicts that have two challenges. A, they threaten the physical well-being of members of minority, usually population, or weaker population, if there are majority populations. And they threaten the cultural or identity component of those populations in the sense that strong majorities usually try to assimilate into them, in order to reduce dissonance and conflict, to assimilate into them members of minority cultures. Jews clearly suffered from both kinds of problems in the many years they spent in the diaspora. They were persecuted, they were evicted, they were expelled, and ultimately there was even an attempt to exterminate them. But in addition, and especially after emancipation, there was a constant challenge to Jews in terms of their maintaining their identity. They couldn't really integrate when Judaism was defined by religion, so many people converted because they couldn't do things they wanted to do without converting. But even after it was allowed for people to remain Jewish and participate like in France and Germany after emancipation. Still, the tendency was to require assimilation in order to really integrate, and ultimately, as Herzl found, even Jews who were willing to do everything that was required in an attempt to privatize their own Jewishness, realized that they were seen somehow as strangers, foreigners, not belonging. Okay, so Zionism as a movement, as a national movement, was a movement that said Jews are a people. It's bad for Jews to live in the diaspora as always being a minority and dispersed. It's bad for them in the sense they are vulnerable physically, but also it's bad for them in the sense that they are vulnerable culturally. And a way of dealing with these two challenges to their well-being, the physical and the cultural identity, is to recreate self-government. And where should that self-government be? You know, some Zionists thought Uganda or Argentina were good enough, but mostly people thought that the only place that could motivate enough Jews to go on this track of renewed political independence was the ancient homeland of Jews, the land of Israel, Zion, because it's such an important part in the cultural and religious, but not only religious, sense of perception of identity, of continuity of Jews, that the only place in which Jews could be really sufficiently attracted to recreate self-government was in Zion, in Jerusalem. So this is the argument in a nutshell. I think it's an argument that, first of all, is persuasive, to me at least, but it's also an argument that is not invoking Jewish particularism. It's an argument that applies to Jews the rationale of the right to self-determination recognized by international law for all peoples. Now, the right to self-determination in international law was recognized in two distinct contexts. One is Europe, in which the empires, Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman, included many national, ethnic, religious groups, gave them autonomy, millet systems, but not political independence. This created a lot of instability and a feeling by the minorities that they were not sufficiently protected. And Wilson, after the First World War, and the United Nations after the Second World War realized that this aspect of group identity needed to be addressed. The Second World War started, as you may remember, when the German citizens or residents of Czechoslovakia and Poland said that they wanted to enjoy the right to self-determination by uniting with the Germans. And this was not seen as something that was a part of a stable international order. Okay, so we are applying this principle. And the other context is the context of post-colonialism, post-imperialism, in which we said that colonial and imperialist powers were trying to control and rule indigenous and native populations in their colonies in a way that denied these peoples their right to self-rule and self-determination, and the right to self-determination was therefore invoked as a way of mobilizing the international community to delegitimate colonialism and imperialism and give autonomy and independence to the nations that had been colonized. Okay. The counter-argument against the right of Jews to have self-determination, made historically by the Arabs, contained three main arguments. One was that Jews were not a people. They were just a religion. We shouldn't treat them as a people. This is not a trivial argument, but as I said, I cannot go into everything. I will assume, for my purposes, that Jews are not only historically a religion, but also a people. So this is one argument. The other argument was that to let a group materialize its right to self-determination it needs to have a critical mass of people in the territory in which the group wants to exercise self-determination. And the Jews, before the beginning of the 20th century, didn't have that in the land of Israel. Now, this is historically correct. And the question here is quite interesting. The question here, since Palestine was not an independent country, it was part of the Ottoman Empire and then part of the Mandate, which was founded in order to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish national home. The question was not whether there was a critical mass of Jews, but the question was it permitted for Jews to try and create a critical mass in the land of Israel? I think the answer to that question is positive. It's quite clear and understandable that the Palestinians and the Arabs resisted that, but we're not talking about power, we're talking about justification. And they didn't have a justified moral reason to object to that because they were not ruling that land. They then said the imperial power cannot give the Jews what was not theirs, it was ours, we were the population. And the Jews said, well, you were the population, but you were guests there because you knew that we had a claim there, and in your own sources you recognize that it is the Jews. I don't want to go into the historical argument, although it's fascinating. I don't want to mention the fact that some Palestinian spokespersons now deny the historical connection of Jews to the land of Israel. I don't think, it's important, it's fascinating, but it's not directly to my point, because I think that at a certain point, say in the 20s, there was a critical mass of Jews in Israel. And from that point on, the question was not, do Jews have a right to come and create this basis? They already had this basis, and now the question was, how do we deal with the relationship between these two communities? And the Arabs said, A, stop immigration, and B, give independence to the territorial unit. Since we are the majority, we're more than 2/3, then we will create an Arab country, and we will control immigration, we will not allow any more immigration and purchase of lands by Jews, and that will be the end of the hope of Jews to become a majority in any part of the land of Israel. The Jews said, no, this is going to undermine our promised right to self-determination. There was a lot of violence, there was a lot of argument, there were many committees, World War II came in. I want to stress that the Peel Commission, 1937, after some violence between Jews and Arabs in Israel, already said, it's a British commission, it's not an international commission, it's a British commission, after the mandatory power conceded that it gave Jews and Arabs inconsistent promises. It gave Jews a promise of establishing a national home, and the Arabs promised that their rights will not be affected. Now, Jews said, your rights, your personal rights will not be affected. You'll even benefit from our enterprise because we are going to bring development and capital into the country, and Jews did. But, of course, what did happen, and the Jews wanted to happen, was that the Arabs became from a majority in the country into a minority in the country. And even if they have full civil and political rights and a better welfare conditions, and I think that the Arabs in Israel have that, this is not a full response to their wish to have self-determination, to have a majority control over their country. Okay, so this is one argument that was used against Zionism from the very beginning to throughout the period. And the third argument says that, okay, even if there was a Jewish community and we needed to do something, the legitimacy of having a Jewish state in even a part of the land of Israel is built on the fact that the benefit for self-determination for the Jews will be much larger than the burden imposed on the rights of non-Jews, primarily the native Arab minority. And the argument goes, this balance is not being held, and therefore Israel as a Jewish state is not legitimate. Now, this this argument was being made forcefully and consistently and rejected by the international community, as I said, from the 20s on. But in 47, the United Nations, more than 2/3, decided to have partition. Jewish state and an Arab state, and a partition in order to allow Jews and Arabs to control their own states, including immigration and security. What happened was that the Arabs objected to that. They threatened that if this is going to pass, they will go to war. They did go to war. Unfortunately for them, they lost that war. And the result was that there was a Jewish state, Israel. It started opening its gates and getting a lot of immigration and consolidating its majority, its Jewish majority. And there was no Arab state in Palestine. Instead, the Egyptians caught and captured the Gaza Strip, and Jordan annexed the West Bank. So no Palestinian state, a Jewish state on a territory that is larger than the original territory for the Jewish state I wanted in there. And ceasefire. 67, now this was accepted by the international community as a temporary arrangement. Israel was accepted as a member of the United Nations, and these were ceasefire lines, but it was accepted and recognized that Israel was the one and only Jewish state. 67, another war started by the Arabs, another attempt to dismantle the Jewish state, another victory for Israel. Now, Israel controls not only the Sinai, not only some of the Golan, but all of the land of Israel, with its Palestinian population. And this is the beginning of a new conception of what is going on. Part of your argument against the legitimacy of the Jewish state now is not in terms of the original terms, although it's very similar, but it says that originally it was two states for two people, it was partition. Now it's really a Jewish state on the whole territory, and this makes Israel an occupier, this makes Israel a militaristic country, this cannot be a democracy, there is no Jewish majority between the Mediterranean Sea and the river, and this shows that Zionism was racism, expansionism was built on the idea of dispossessing the Arabs, etc. Okay. So this is the argument. I think the argument, first of all, I think it's very important to distinguish the post-67 argument from the pre-67 argument, because now what we see is that the argument is not about post-67, because now it's more or less agreed, I think there is a majority in Israel and the international community, that there should be some self-determination for Palestinians, and that Israel should be contracted to more or less, corrections, 67 lines, we don't know what happens to the settlement, it's not important. The argument against the legitimacy of the Jewish state does not stop there. It is an argument against the very legitimacy of the idea of a Jewish state, even within the 67 borders. Okay. So now, what are the implications of the state of the argument today? I think that the argument that was rejected by the United Nations on 29th November 1947 is a bad argument. It was a bad argument in 47, and it is a bad argument today. And there is no reason to reopen this argument, because since 47 until now, Israel is the home of probably the strongest Jewish community in the world. And to deny these Jews the right to exercise self-determination in their country is to not only do something that is undemocratic, but is to unsettle so many people whose only home is the state of Israel. We're not talking about a minority that is claiming the right to statehood. We are talking about a very large group, a very large history of political independence that is asked to give up its distinction. Now, is the situation of the Arab minority in Israel so unacceptable to make the claim of the Jewishness of the state objectionable? This is a debated question. Again, I cannot go into the details. Maybe there will be answers, questions and answers about that. But I think the answer is no. The Arab citizens of Israel enjoy full civil and political rights. They participate in elections. They have sent their representatives to the Knesset. They are fully integrated into the economic, social life of the country. I don't think that there is anything on the face of it that suggests that the level of tensions that does exist between the two groups, especially against the background of the unresolved conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, I don't think it amounts to the kind of level that justifies saying that because of its treatment of its minority, Israel cannot continue to exercise self-determination for Jews in Israel. Okay. I think that what we see now, therefore, is a combination of two things. One is criticism of policies of Israel. For instance, policies of more settlements, policies of refusal to have peace, policies of arguing that Israel is putting obstacles on the way of peace and things like that. These are valid criticism. They need to be evaluated by the questions, the facts on the ground. I think the situation is very mixed. It's complicated. Again, it's a political question. I don't want to go into that. I think that this kind of criticism against Israeli governments is obviously legitimate, justified sometimes, and it's a criticism voiced very effectively, freely within Israel. I don't think that there is a single argument against Israeli policies that is not endorsed, expressed very vocally, and dealt with within Israel proper and on Israel's podium of the parliament. So it's not if this is a silenced issue, it's a debate. In democracy, you debate and then it's the other thread that we are saying is something completely different. It's a delegitimation of the very idea that within any kind of borders, there could be a justified Jewish state. This is the declared position of the Hamas, because they see all the land of Israel as part of the sacred waqf that does not allow any other sovereignty. But if you read closely, this is the position of most of the leaders of the Fatah. And this is, more importantly, the position of most of the leaders of the Arab minority within Israel. Now, this is something completely different. I think this is something that should be addressed. I think this argument is wrong. I think it's misleading. And I think it's dangerous because it creates the assumption that what happens with the claim of Israel to continue to be the only place in the world in which Jews enjoy self-determination is a claim that is immanently, inherently racist, objectionable, and bad. And I think this is something that people who want to see some resolution of the conflict should be very, very worried about. Because we are only going to get a resolution if if both parties understand that the other side is there to stay. And if there is a movement that delegitimates one of the sides, the Jews, and implies that it's going to be acceptable that that side disappears, it's unlikely that the other side, the Arabs, will give up their principled objection to the Jewish state. So in a paradoxical way, people who want a solution of two states for two people, who think that this is the just solution, should be very clear that it should be two states for two people. That means that there should be also full support for a Palestinian state, but for a Jewish state, not just a neutral Israel, a Jewish state alongside it. Thank you very much.
Well, if response puts too highly about what I'm about to offer to you tonight. I have had the good fortune of being able to read the paper on which this presentation was based. And Ruth, if I may say, you have that wonderful talent of writing as you speak. So I've had a very enjoyable few hours over the last week in which I have had the sense of really spending an afternoon or so in the presence of the lively, penetrating mind that you have just heard today, and the sense of the presence of someone who is both entirely willing to engage and entirely unafraid to make a controversial argument. I know that she will have inspired in many of you's questions and comments, and I don't want to get in the way of them. Let me just offer a couple of comments. The central feature, as I understand it, of Ruth's paper is to make an argument in defence of Israel in terms that appeal to universal values and do not invoke Jewish particularism. And that's the power of the project, because it has then the power to convince those who don't share a connection through religion or culture with Israel. But it has another power too, and that's the one that kept creeping into my mind in my enjoyable afternoon spent in the presence of Ruth's mind this week, and that is it connects to problems elsewhere in the world. And as I read the paper, I couldn't help but reflect upon some of the very serious problems faced in our own society, and there are little pieces of the paper that jumped out and have stayed in my mind and I know will return to me as I contemplate social problems on the other side of the world. One thing that comes through Ruth's paper is the inevitable prominence of history in our understanding of the justice of our current social arrangements. And the paper conveys welcomes the critical self-reflection on Israeli history that is currently becoming more prominent in Israeli public debate. And this phrase leapt out of me: no good can come of bad history. And it is an injunction I think we all need to follow with respect to our own consideration of our problems. Secondly, I was very struck by Ruth's invocation of the challenge of creating shared citizenship in a society where people are deeply divided amongst competing conceptions of the good. And her injunction that it is candour, sensitivity, and acknowledging the narratives of the other side that are central to the creation of the shared citizenship that will enable us to resolve our problems. Again, an injunction that I'm sure will return to me. And tonight, this phrase leapt out at me: we are only going to get a resolution of conflict if we realise that the other side is here to stay. Now, what is most challenging about the paper we've just heard is it combines that critical self-reflection, that openness and candour, that willingness to listen and deeply reflect upon arguments with which we disagree, but there is no sense of intellectual paralysis that comes out of that critical reflection. We've heard a robust defence of the State of Israel, a denial of the connection between Zionism and racism in very interesting and provocative terms. And it's my pleasure now to throw the floor open for questions, which Ruth has generally agreed to take.